Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today I have the pleasure of going live with Faith Burkowski from High Five Literacy, and we're going to be talking about the third book in her series, focusing on the librarian. And I read this book a couple of weeks ago and then I reviewed it again today, and it just definitely has a lot of great information in it.
Thank you.
And yeah, so I look forward to talking about it. But before we go into that, why don't we take a moment? I'll give you a little bit of background about who I am, and Faith can talk about who she is and what she does. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth. I am the founder of Garforth Education. And at Garforth Education, it's all about helping parents get access to the information that they need to support their children, and help teachers get access to the information that they need to know about supporting their students learning how to read and become proficient readers.
Hi, I'm Faith Burkowski. I'm the founder of High Five Literacy and Academic Coaching. I was a classroom teacher, reading specialist, literacy coach, and administrator. Right now, I presently do consulting work, training, and tutoring. So this has been a real pleasure, Kathryn. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for making this a three-part series, because the books were intended to be read as a set. However, if people only wanted to focus on one part, they could get the books separately. So this is the book that we're on tonight. And it's written as a tale, right? A family, a fictional family, using animals to describe complex topics in a very simple way, so that parents could feel as though they could understand it without any type of educational jargon involved, and be part of the conversation when they go to school. So that is really the purpose of this. And this last book really focuses on the decoding piece, and how certain books can really fit in with phonics instruction a little bit better than the books that they might have in school.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's important that we highlight the difference between, a beginning reader who's still learning the code and a proficient reader, because they actually approach reading words differently. So while an individual is still learning how to read words, they're going to decode them. Well, if they're taught how to decode, they are going to be decoding them. So they're going to take each letter and associate the sound with it, so that they can sound a word like cat out, and they go k-act, and they blend those words together. Through repeated exposure, they're going to be able to move that word into their sight vocabulary, or words that they can recognize within a fraction of a second. So when they see that word, they're no longer sounding it out, and it would actually take them longer to sound the word out than it would just for them to recognize it. So that's what we're trying to do. And when we're talking about using decodable books, we're not saying use them for every student. We're saying use them for those beginning readers who are still at the stage of having to sound out words, because they don't have a large sight vocabulary and they can't recognize these words instantaneously.
So I'm going to backtrack a bit. So first, yes, everything you said as far as how we move a word into long-term memory through repeated exposures in the code is accurate, right? So in other words, when kids are first learning, if we're talking about emergent readers, and they are being taught to make those connections between the sounds they hear in a word and the letters they see, there's effort involved at the beginning. Anytime you learn something new, it takes effort, and it's going to take them a while to sound it out. Then once they understand and they have letter-sound correspondence, then it's a matter of practice. The books that many children are given at the beginning of their schooling do not follow a sequence. They're given words that they don't even have to sound out because the pictures and the pattern of the language, the repetitive, predictable pattern of the language, pretty much informs what the words are without really having to work their way through a word. So the books that we're talking about tonight are called decodable books. So decode essentially means to sound out. And that's what we want to reinforce for kids. We want them to get enough practice in saying the sounds, saying the word, pushing the sounds together until they don't have to actually sound it out anymore. They could just look at the word, and it gives the appearance as if they're just, getting it. But this has come after many exposures of putting these sounds together.
I think it's important to highlight that it's not because they've memorized what the word looks like. It's because they actually know that those letters represent that word. And it's not that they've memorized it because they can tell in different fonts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's written in capitals or lowercase, it's not that they've memorized the image or the picture.
Right. So you mentioned something very important. So in other words, and I think David Kilpatrick pointed that out with the different fonts. That's probably where you saw that, because I saw him do that too. Where you could have the same word and you could put it with some capitals, lowercase letters. You could put it into big print, all caps. It doesn't matter. If a child understands letter sound connections, they could work their way through the word.
Where you could have this.
Oh, I just heard an echo. Did you?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. So anyhow, it shouldn't matter about what the font is. Now, if a child is memorizing the word as a picture, they won't recognize the word if the font changes, right? So if they know stop, even, as, STOP in capital letters, and then all of a sudden they see it, mixed up, lowercase, capital, all lowercase, they might not know because they're not using their correspondences to read the word. They're looking at it as a whole. So can you memorize words as pictures? Yes, you can. You can look at it and look at it as a picture, but you're not going to get very far in reading other words. You can only memorize a certain number of words as a picture after repeated exposures of seeing it, like some symbol, like the McDonald's arches. You can do that, but that's not how we read. We don't learn to read that way. There's a difference. And that's the misunderstanding that I think really has been a problem in schools for years now. We know it.
Definitely. And I think it's really important that this becomes common knowledge. And even when you're talking about sight words is something that people, used to use more commonly for like red letter words or irregularly spelt words that you can't sound out and decode every letter and get it so it's saying what you think it does. And that is not the same as a word that's in your sight vocabulary.
Yes.
Right? The sight vocabulary is words that you can recognize. And we need to move those irregularly spelt words into our sight vocabulary so we're not stuck sounding them out. But you also put words that are phonetic into your sight vocabulary and you have that instantaneous recognition.
Yeah, so that's something that also is misunderstood, where you could see a list of words, and many of those sight words are actually completely decodable. I mean, the word and there's nothing tricky about the word and. You know all the sounds, you could get through the word. And yet it's something that we say as a sight word. Then you have other words where maybe a small part of it is not regular at the moment because that child did not get up to that part of the code. It's a little bit more advanced and it's coming in earlier in their learning. So they're learning it as a sight word. But if we really try to teach all words through letter sound correspondences, and then we could kind of tease out what is difficult about certain words and, focus on what's irregular at the moment until perhaps they learn at another point in time, oh yeah, that does make sense to me now. So where, let's say they didn't learn EA yet, just throwing that out there. And it could be embedded in a word that's there at the moment that they're expected to know, doesn't mean that you can't figure it out. So it's easy enough to just say, well, in that word, those letters are showing the sound for E or for F or whatever it is. And so now let's work our way through it. And then later on, when you really teach that at a sensible time, as you build up skills, then you could see other words that have that pattern. But that's not really how it's done. Generally, kids are given lists of words even before they understand any letter sound correspondence. And they're expected to just know the words from the list. And this is basically what shows up in those leveled books. Lots of words that are high frequency words, right, that you see often. And then it's used again and again in these books. And then kids are getting mixed messages because they don't know when to sound out words and then when to use their memory of sight words. So if you're telling a child, oh, well, these are our sight words and these are words we sound out, they're going to end up trying to just memorize everything. And that's what they do. They will use whatever means possible to figure out that word, whether it's through pictures, whether it's through the predictable pattern. They're going to use that as their default strategy, especially if they have, if they're having trouble decoding, they're going to resort to something like that. Other kids where they're more typical learners, they might be able to figure out the code without this real explicit instruction, but many kids won't.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that the way that you teach reading is going to have an impact on the way that these kids are approaching reading. So if you start with a very good foundation in phonics and teach that decodable strategy, then we can move through these decodable texts quite quickly, right?
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned before how they're not for everybody. I'm going to...
What I meant was, like, once everybody can start with them.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said that.
No, I mean that everybody can start with them, but once you have kids that are reading and are no longer needing to decode, they don't need them.
Yes.
Right?
Okay, good.
You can move on from them. I'm not saying, and you have those kids that show up to school, with great phonological awareness, great decoding already. They have the strategies needed. So you may use them just to make sure that they're at the benchmark and they know how to use it, but don't stick them to stay at those decodable books because they're past that skill. And we don't want to, kill the joy of reading, which I think is a big thing that people from, the balanced literacy and the whole language approach take from it. Oh, if we're sticking them in decodable books all the time, they're going to hate reading because it's not fun. but if
Yeah.
they can read it and they can read it fluently and everything, then they shouldn't be reading it anymore. They should be moving on to the next one, right?
Right. Now, I actually put up a couple of posts today that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that you could use that for one of your Mythbusters.
Yeah.
So that the myth is that decodable text is boring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you really look at high quality decodable books, you will see that many of them are written beautifully. And the kids don't find them boring at all, because there's nothing boring about being able to read the words on the page. For a young child, that is thrilling.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to step out of our adult bodies and really try to get into a child's mind. And for a child who's just starting to feel successful and seeing, oh, yes, I could really, truly get through the words on the page, and I understand how to do this, that is very exciting for them. And, I think if you look at it next to a book that uses the repetitive language, like I can do blank at the library. I think that's what I posted. I don't even remember. It was something like that. I can do blank at the library. I can do blank at the library. I can do blank at the library. I don't think that's so thrilling. To be honest, I don't think you could look at that. I'm not saying it's not a joyful read if you're sharing a book out loud. If you read a book out loud and maybe the child is about to go on a trip to the library, never, stepped foot in a library, and you start trying to expose the child to expectations, what they're going to see in the library, well, then that's a fine book to read out loud and talk about the library experience. But to think that a young child who doesn't know how to put letters and sounds together could truly read library if you took the pictures away and you took the repetition of the phrase away, no, they would not be able to read library. They're forced to have to use the pictures. They're forced to have to use other types of cues to get through that. And that might work in these earlier books pretty easily for a kid who has pretty strong language skills and kind of could navigate the book pretty well. They could fool you. Well, oh yes, I'm reading a book, and they keep turning pages and they keep looking around. And then all of a sudden, it gets a little harder and a little harder. And the pictures start to go away. And the sentences are not in that repetitive, predictable way anymore. They're written as true sentences, authentic sentences. All of a sudden, by the time they get to about, a K or an L, I've had kids who just stay there. Even if they could get through the lower books, many of them can't, but even if they could get through some of those lower books, the real test comes about KLM for those older kids. They don't move, because then it's really, there's nothing about those books that could get you past that point if they don't know the code, if they don't know how to get through multi-syllable words, if they don't understand how words work.
Mm-hmm.
It just, they just get frozen at a certain point. And they just start guessing all over the place. Their eyes are jumping everywhere. And it's not a tracking problem. People think this is a visual tracking problem.
And that's where we get the visual training, but it's because they're being trained to look elsewhere for clues, right?
Correct. And I won't say all the time. There are certain kids, and I always want to clear that up because, there are people watching who will say, well, wait a minute, my child really does have a vision problem. Yes, there are vision problems, but that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about a kid who really, could have dyslexia, has trouble understanding how to read, we are almost encouraging them to jump all over the page instead of left to right all through the word, which is what they should be doing if they're taught correctly with the right tools.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I wanted to bring up was this quote from the Reading Ape. And he's talking about how the use of controlled text, excuse me, the use of controlled text removes the reason or excuse for guessing, and guessing can be unstitched by references to teach and to learn the code knowledge. So what we're really focusing on tonight is talking about teaching these children phonics and giving them the books that they have the skills to read. And from your book, you said the books children are given to practice should be match what they are learning. Decodable books are only decodable if children are first taught the code and taught and understand the code.
Right. So there's nothing decodable. It's not like the books are magically going to do this. Now, there are some books that are designed very well, like I See Sam, where they're meant as a teaching tool and they're decodable. And basically, it follows where if you're just using those letters and sounds and it's cumulative, they're getting practice. The design of it really ensures that they're going to not only get practice, but it's being used as a tool to teach with. But what I'm saying is, you can't just take a decodable book off a shelf and say, okay, now this child will be able to decode it. So if there are words in it that have, let's say, OU as ooh, like in soup, and they have no idea, and like group, and they only knew OU as ow, well, then that's not decodable for them at that point unless they're taught to flex the vowel, that OU represents ow, maybe most of the time, but it can also show the oo sound. So it's only decodable if we're showing kids the code and how to use it properly. And that quote that you just mentioned, yeah, that control in the text for a new reader is just so important to their learning. It's not an extra. It's not something that should just be like, okay, if they have it, fine. If they don't, that's okay too. Because what's happening, what I'm seeing, and I think you and I were having this conversation before, even when teachers embrace phonics, and they're seeing the science of reading, and you see that, oh, there are teachers coming around saying, yes, phonics is important. One of the hardest things for teachers to change is this thought that they have to be in these types of leveled books. They'll do the phonics, but they don't want to give the decodable books a chance to really reinforce what they're learning in phonics. I find that is one of the hardest things to change. I could tell you where I live on Long Island, most school districts, even if they have some kind of phonics program, and they vary in terms of effectiveness and how serious they are about teaching the phonics, from it could be a 5 to 10 minute sound drill of A, apple, a, E, ed, to actually doing some more work. But then after they might do a beautiful phonics lesson, they're being put into leveled books where they don't even use those skills. And this misunderstanding really hurts kids, especially ones with dyslexia. Because like I said, a typical reader might be able to transfer some of their understanding to something that's not controlled. But kids with any type of decoding problem, they need that practice to see it again and again, like you said, in order to make those words into sight words, all words, not just high frequency words.
Exactly. And it's important that we do that, especially because, as you were mentioning earlier, as they get to that KLM level and the level text, that's when it's also, they can't do they can't use the predictable nature. And that's when we're seeing the kids in grade 3 and grade 4 hit that brick wall, right? Because they can't use those strategies in the bookmarks that they send home, because the pictures aren't telling them anything. And it's not a repeating pattern. And they're being introduced so many new vocabulary words by this point. Like, by the time they reach grade 4, they're getting about 1,000 new vocabulary words.
Yes.
From reading.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
If you haven't heard the word before, you're not going to be able to guess it.
Correct.
Context or anything.
That's right. So, yeah, we call that, this term has been around forever. I didn't coin it, but it's called the 4th grade slump. Yeah. And so definitely by 4th grade, when that transition from learning to read to reading to learn really happens, and it starts to happen, like you said, in 3rd grade for sure. But by 4th grade, when they already are expected to read text that's text outside their world, right? Their home, their friends, where they're really reading to learn at this point. And they're given multisyllable words, and they're given lots of prefixes and suffixes, and they don't know how to get through those bigger words. It all falls apart. And so you will have 4-syllable words turn into 2-syllable words. Happens all the time, where they see the beginning, they see the end, they leave out the middle, they change the middle, they mix up the syllables, and then people think that, oh yeah, they're just seeing things backwards. But you certainly know it has nothing to do with seeing things backwards. It's holding on to a sequence of chunks in a bigger word and being able to remember that and hold on to it to come up with the word. So It all falls apart by then. So if this does not happen early enough, K-2, starting to build in the preschool years a good sound letter foundation, going into those K-2 years where they're really focused on building letter sound connections and practicing, that's when you get kids older in decodable books, right? Ideally, you would want to keep them only in decodables in those early grades until they're ready to move out. But that's why there is a need for these types of books for older kids, because we have so many older kids who did not get it in the earlier grades.
Of course. And I think this is a perfect time to talk about how, when we have these students in older grades, it's really important to supplement the decodable books with audiobooks. And, a lot of people are like, oh, well, audiobooks is cheating. Well, it's not cheating, because they can't read the book. And if they can't get access to it any other way than listening to it, is going to give them the information that they need to learn, that their peers are learning. It's going to give them the vocabulary exposure that they're not going to get from reading. Because yes, some of these controlled texts do have some of the higher vocabulary, but if they don't have the skill to decode these words, which often are morphographically complex words, right? So they have a lot of prefixes and suffixes, and a lot of the scholastic words or the academic language is based in Latin and Greek morphology, right? So if they don't have the skills to decode those words and they're not reading them, they're not going to have that same exposure. And just in the classroom isn't enough, because our conversation or typically use these words as frequently. So that's why, having the audio back that they can listen to and get the exposure to. And it's also, don't just get the audiobooks for the classroom content books. get the audiobooks for the popular fiction that their friends are reading so they can relate to, the Harry Potter books that everybody's reading, but it's way above their level. And there's no way that they can access it, but they can listen to it.
Yes, or somebody could read it to them and have a conversation. And that's something I would like to mention. Audiobooks are great as a supplement, as you're saying, to keep kids in grade level or above material, because otherwise they are not, they're not getting what they need for their age. They're just not. However, the problem with audiobooks is that it's one way. Right. So they're only getting this language receptively without a conversation going on. So there's no one who's stopping it and then maybe talking about it, checking in to see if they're understanding it. So, I mean, my preference is, if possible, if there is an adult at home who can read, I mean, the issue is sometimes parents have trouble reading too. So we have to take that into account. But I do like the idea of an adult doing a read aloud so that there is this conversation, this back and forth. We talked about that in an earlier session. So where there's this back and forth, not just one way listening. So that makes the kids actively involved in the story. So I do think you lose something with audio in that regard. But certainly it's better than not having any of the books to talk about, right? So if there's nobody there to read aloud with them, notice I use the word with instead of to, but with them, then of course, that is something that should be available to them.
Yeah, definitely. And you have mentioned that it's important to make sure that the level of the book meets like when you're using decodable books, that the sounds are taught. And so that's making sure that the book goes along with a phonics program that you're using. And there are some great free resources for decodable text, and they will typically tell you the series of letters that are expected to be known for the student to read this book. And it's all about the cumulative knowledge that the child has, right? So I think, why don't we take a moment and talk about what phonics programs are and how they have a strategic approach to teaching the letters. Because I see in a lot of kindergarten grade 1 classrooms, the beginning of the year, they start at A. And at the end of the year, they are like 26 weeks later.
Letter of the week.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah, so that's old school, right? That's, do the letter of the week. You cut out pictures from a magazine that all begin with the letter A, and you work your way through it. Yeah, I'm hoping that most of that type of thinking, I hope, is gone. But you never know. So, all right. So the architecture of a strong phonics program should be where there are a few sounds, a couple of vowels, and a handful of consonants. That's all you really need to get multiple words. I mean, that's the beauty of phonics, where rather than just, I see a word was, I know the word was, that's the end. You can't get anything more out of that word. But if I know this, like 8 different sounds, I could get about 40 words out of that I could mix those sounds up and move them together, left to right, all through the word. And I could be then reading a lot more than just memorizing some words. So a good phonics program, if it's built the way we're talking about, that's truly systematic, there is a system involved that moves through simple to complex, starting at some of the basic skills. And then, of course, it gets harder. But as it gets harder, you're still always reviewing the easier stuff. So it always cycles back. And a good decodable book not only brings in the new, but goes back and cycles through what was already taught. So they're getting more exposures. That's what we talked about, which builds some fluency, right? And automatic recognition of words. That's what we want, without memorizing words. So, and that's the key. So it should be systematic. It should be cumulative. It should be a program where it's understood why we're doing something. So in other words, let's say you have AI and AY, showing the A sound. So you're starting with the A sound. So you might start off with some of the easiest ways to show the A sound. The A consonant E, the AI, and the AY. And maybe that's it in the book that's new. Everything else has been taught already. But then maybe in a set above, they start bringing in another way to show the A sound that's a little bit more complex. It's not something as common. So you're going to then maybe bring in later on, maybe EIGH for A, like in the number 8, the word 8. Maybe you're going to bring in the EA that now used to only be the E sound. Now you can flex it to the A sound, like, and that's great. Or to have a piece of steak. So you don't do this all at once. I think that's also a misunderstanding where, we have one sound and we have to do all the different ways at once. No, what a good phonics program does do is it does go through the multiple ways, but it doesn't all have to happen in one shot. You do the most common first, and then eventually you'll get there, doing things that don't come up as often, but a reader still needs to see those patterns. So a good phonics program matched with good practice will give you that.
And an important note to have, if you're using one of those in a classroom setting and you have a student who's absent, because this is a cumulative program in nature, you need to make sure that you take that time aside and teach the student that was absent for that day so they're not missing a sound.
Exactly. Because since it does build, right, if they are missing something, then they're going on, they're not going to be able to just pick it up. That's the whole point of this. We have to be very explicit and make sure that all kids are getting this information. Now, after a while, there are some kids through what we would call statistical learning. There are kids where they don't even need to get through the whole code. All of a sudden, their reading starts to take off. Once they understand some letters and sounds and patterns, they just actually can figure out, oh yeah, I know how to flex. Once they know how to flex the vowel, all of a sudden they kind of intuitively say, oh, I'll try one way, I'll try the other way. But a child with profound difficulties will not just get that without being taught every step of the way. So, and that's what you were saying before, Kathryn, that for some kids, we don't need to take them through a whole series of decodables for, 3 straight years in a row. Some kids who pick it up faster, will put them in anything you want. They're not limited anymore. But for other kids, we have to keep them there a little bit longer until they get those 1,000 practice opportunities or whatever it takes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Faith. I've really enjoyed our conversations. And before we go, I want to make sure that you talk about the Facebook group on decodable text that you were speaking about earlier.
Yes. So anybody who is interested in learning more about decodable books, Marion Waldman of Teach My Kid to Read has a Facebook group. I'm also a founder of that group. And people are on there. We have authors of decodable books on there. There are people sharing about decodable books that they've used and enjoyed. So I do recommend that you take a look at that book, that Facebook group. It's called Let's Talk About Decodable Books. And also the nonprofit group that I'm involved in, Teach My Kid to Read, is all about involving the community, involving parents. It's really all about involving people, not just the school people, but other people, pediatricians, early childhood people, daycare people, librarians, who could help and be knowledgeable and get kids early enough. That's the whole point. We want to make sure that kids are not being picked up in 3rd grade, 4th grade, as you mentioned, that we're getting them before they even start school or at the beginning of their schooling, and that parents know the right questions to ask. That's the whole point of the group, and to be able to support instruction through library programs. So I do hope you look at those two things, the Facebook group and
you have the same.
All right, yeah, no, so it's good. We've just shared it within the comments.
Great, thank you so much.
Sorry, when I switch off the screen and yeah. Anyways, technology is.
I know, it's okay, it's all right. It's been such a real pleasure, Kathryn, and I so appreciate you having me on. I'm sorry?
We're still live. I just meant that you could hear the repeat. But yes.
I'm still thanking you.
Okay.
It's okay. I can thank you in public. I knew I was live. I'm just saying thank you. Thank you for having me. And I do appreciate this. And I hope we talk again.
Of course. All right. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Okay. We're off. Awesome. Thanks. I've just joined the group.
Okay, terrific.
Shared within the comments. I will try and get this up in the next couple of days.
Okay.
And go from there. Yeah.
All right. And that when I said about the Mythbusters, I really meant it. That is one you could add to your Mythbusters, that decodable books are boring or something, some nonsense like that, that there really can be some very good decodable books that are fun and interesting.
Oh yeah, of course.
That is a myth. So.
Well, why don't we think about some and then plan to get together and film some more?
Okay, sure.
And even because you have that other book, I can't remember what it's called, but if you want to send that to me, I can go through it and try and pull some out of that.
Are you talking about failing students, failing schools? Are you talking?
I don't know. I'm horrible at remembering names, but you have another book that a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, so this one is filled with things. This one is a different type of read. It doesn't have pictures or characters or anything. Yeah. And this one is really meant for elementary school and above. Mm-hmm. And it talks about my experiences as coach in the schools, mm-hmm. and what I've seen and why I feel that it's not the students, it's the schools, it's the instructional piece that's failing.